Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of Rev 250's advisory committee. Rev 250 is a consortium of about 60 organizations planning commemorations and engagement with the story of the American Revolution. And our Revolution 250 administrator, Jonathan Lane, is with us, and we have as a guest someone who is always engaged with the story of the American Revolution, and that is J.L. Bell. And John Bell maintains the wonderful blog Boston 1775, which is history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about the American Revolution in Massachusetts. And every day he has a new story. So, John, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you, Jonathan.
Thank you, John.
And this week is a portentous week for anniversaries. February 22nd of 1770 was a big event, actually, in the story of the Revolution.
Yes, a couple of them. The event that drew me in was on February 22nd, 1770. So that's 11 days before the Boston Massacre. And that's when the very first death of the political conflict in Massachusetts occurred. We could argue that there was a death off the coast of Massachusetts before then, but really the central conflict of the Revolution, the new Parliament revenue laws versus the local resistance to those laws on various grounds, they all came to a head outside the house of a customs man named Ebenezer Richardson in the middle of the day on February 22nd, 1770. Richardson's house was being mobbed by a group of boys and young men and possibly older men, and he shot a gun out a window, and most of the shot from the gun went into the chest of a little boy named Christopher Seider, who died later that day. And
now, where was Richardson? Where was Richardson's house, John?
We don't know exactly. It would be lovely to know. But what we do know is that this event started in the north end of Boston, so a working class commercial neighborhood. It started at the shop of a man named Theophilus Lillie, who was one of the dozen or so business people who were still importing goods from Britain instead of boycotting those to protest the Townshend Act. So he was one of the enemies of the people, as the town meeting was referring to them. And there was a picket line set up outside his shop. And this was on Thursday. Thursdays, schools let out early in Boston. It was also the market day, so there were a lot more farmers and people from the rural areas coming into town to sell their goods. So it was pretty crowded, and the boys were free. And they had, since January, been picketing the shops of importers. And this day, they all moved to Theophilus Lillie's shop. They set up their signs. They marched around. They yelled at people going into the shop. And Ebenezer Richardson came by. Ebenezer Richardson was a customs officer, a low-level customs officer, what is called a land waiter or tide waiter, an unskilled job. But he had gotten that job because he had been an informant earlier. He had given secret information to the government. And that made him, of course, very unpopular. The reason he gave secret information is because he didn't really have any other way to support himself, because even before that, he had been a farmer out in Woburn, and he had, well, it's a long story, but he had gotten his wife's sister pregnant and then let everybody in town believe that the minister had done it. And when this all came out, because his wife died and he remarried to her sister, then he was suddenly extremely unpopular in Woburn. So he came to Boston, became an informant, and then became himself extremely unpopular in Boston. So he was
made friends everywhere he went.
Exactly. He's not the sort of person who you would think of as successful. And the only way he could get a living was by working as a customs man. And indeed, there's a small riot, as Boston riots go, in 1766, in which the crowd interferes with a search of a man's warehouse in the North End, and the schoolboys come out and they see what's happening, and they decide at the end of the day to go and stand outside Richardson's house and jeer him. That's how unpopular he was. That's how everybody knew who he was and disliked him. So Richardson comes by, on February 22nd, 1770. And he tries to break up this crowd outside Theophilus Lilly's house. He didn't really have a reason. I mean, he was a customs officer. So in a way, he was a law enforcement officer, and the customs service depended on the Townsend duties. So in a way, he was looking after his own interest, but he probably didn't like the fact that these boys were bullying this shopkeeper.
Can we back up, John? Didn't Lilly have some writings in the Boston press earlier?
The reason the boys had chosen his shop that week is that the week before, in the previous week, he had published an essay in one of the Boston newspapers, which made the case, and very eloquently, that he was exercising his individual rights not to join the boycott. The boycott was based on the sort of a community feeling that we're all in this. We have a community collective interest in protesting the Townsend Acts. Therefore, everybody should be involved. And he was trying to make the case, which it resonates very much with us these days, that as an individual, I get to make my choice. And he made the terrific argument that I have less to fear from a tyrant 3,000 miles away than from 10,000 tyrants on my doorstep, and I don't know what they're going to do next.
Wow.
So naturally, he became a target. Naturally, somebody had to stop this. And that's why suddenly for the first time, the boycott, the picket lines shifted to Theophilus Lilly's shop, which was on Union Street in the North End. Richardson came by, he tried to break up the thing, he tried to knock over the signs, he stomped away angrily, and the boys, recognizing who he was, followed him to his house, which was around a corner or half a block away. It's very unclear where it was compared to Lilly's shop, and we don't have an address, and he doesn't seem to have been rich enough to own the real estate, so there's no way to know where this all happened.
Wow. So
gradually the violence outside his shop, outside his house grew. The boys were throwing things. They were throwing sticks. They were throwing garbage. They were throwing things at his wife. They broke his windows. He had young daughters, including probably the baby who had been born out in Woburn, in the house with him. So it was kids against kids in a way. And finally, he went up. A sailor for the customs office came by and offered help. They went up to the second floor. They got guns. Richardson leaned out his window, snapped his gun, which means he shot it without any ammunition in it, just to make the noise, just to make people realize. The boys ran away. They came back, running and screaming, and as the newspaper said, and finally he shot actual live ammunition, a bird shot of some sort, into the crowd, and he mortally wounded one boy, Christopher Seider, and wounded another, Samuel Gore.
Wow. Now, do we know much about Christopher Seider and who he was?
He was, in the words of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a poor German boy. We know a bit more from genealogical records. There was a group of Germans recruited to work in, mostly from the Palatinate in central Germany. They were recruited to work in Maine, up in the Broadbear area, but some of them settled in the part of Braintree, now Quincy, called Germantown. The reason they settled, it was called Germantown, is they settled there in numbers. They were there mostly to work on a set of sort of proto-industrial sites set up by the Palmer family. So a glassworks was one, potash, things like that. That enterprise failed spectacularly in the early 1760s, and the Seider family moved to Boston, and they were living on Frog Lane, which is now better known as Boylston Street, near the Common. They were still a poor working class family. There were a number of children. Christopher seems to have been one of the youngest. Interestingly, there are a couple of other things we know about him. from the way people described him after his death. One was that he was living at Madame Apthorp's, which probably suggests that he had become a household servant to a rich Anglican widow named Grisel Apthorp. The Seiders family worshipped at King's Chapel, and Grisel Apthorp was a sort of pillar of this church. She was immensely wealthy, very pious, so she may have just sort of taken him in. She may have wanted a bootblack or some sort of household servant, but in any case, he was living at her house instead of at his with his parents. And there is one mention from a woman who said that she had gone to school with him, which indicates that he, at some level, was going to school, probably a reading school as a young boy, learning how to read. When he died, he was found, according to the newspaper, to have had several heroic pieces in his pockets, which were probably broadsides that were sold for the masses. And one of them is called Wolfe's Summit of Human Glory. There's a copy of this at the Massachusetts Historical Society. It is an account of General James Wolfe storming Quebec in 1759, and it's very heroic and very military, and it's a rather odd thing, especially if it was this edition, because it's quite large, for a little boy to be carrying around in his pocket. But it does indicate that Christopher Seider was literate and was in some way interested in larger things, in the empire, in politics, in the military.
Now, let's just go back to Richardson and what happens to him. Christopher Seider falls down and the other boy falls down. And then what happens with Richardson?
Immediately, the crowd, the men in the crowd, or the men who are watching, react angrily and they storm the house. Now, of course, at this point, he's been shown to have guns and be willing to use them. So I'm sure they were a little wary about it, but they were breaking into the front of the house, breaking into the back of the house. They dragged him out into the street, and they were at one point trying to put a rope around his neck and hang him there. Even though at this point Christopher Seider was still alive, there was not yet any murder. There was no capital crime yet. And the man who waded into the crowd and got Richardson away and got him to Faneuil Hall for an inquiry, the start of the judicial process, was William Molyneux, who was the radical leader of the Boston Whigs, the man who was overseeing these boycotts and these picket lines and looking on approvingly earlier in the month at what the boys were doing. So he is probably on the scene, sort of supervising or at least applauding, and then had to go in and break up what had become a lynch mob. The crowd dragged Richardson to Faneuil Hall, where he was indicted in front of magistrates, all of whom were very strong Whigs, and then sent to jail to be tried eventually for murder.
Wow. And so Christopher Seider is dead. And is there a funeral for him?
Yes, Christopher Seider lingers that day, and he died that evening, supposedly giving heroic, manly farewells to his parents. Then Dr. Joseph Warren conducts an autopsy and pulls 24 pellets out of the little boy's body. There are very laudatory write-ups about him in the newspapers, and on the 26th of February 1770, there is a huge funeral in Boston, which is obviously been orchestrated by the Boston Whigs to try to wring the most public sympathy out of this event. So it starts with 50 schoolboys all walking in procession, and the Christopher's special friends holding the pall as the cloth over the coffin as it is carried through the town. And this funeral procession, this funeral is at King's Chapel, and the burial is at the Granary Burying Ground, which are not that far away, but the funeral starts at his Christopher Seider's father's house and goes down to Liberty Tree and all the way up into the center of town. There are signs on Liberty Tree about taking innocent blood. There are carriages, probably Madame Apthorp's carriage, Whig carriages. John Adams happens to be in town that day and says it is the largest funeral he'd ever seen. So this was supposed to be the big outrage that should get all of Boston upset at the customs office.
And Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem about this, talking about how
Phyllis Wheatley, who was she was jumping on a lot of deaths. She wrote a lot of occasional poetry about people dying, and yes, she wrote a poem about, as she called it, Mr. Snyder. There was also eventually there was a woodcut engraving of the shooting, which I believe exists in only one copy, and in an archive in Philadelphia, and it's very poorly preserved. But considering how many poor children lived and died, or grew up and died in America with nothing about them, the fact that we have all this newspaper covers, this poetry, this image, shows how much Christopher Seider symbolized for the Boston Whigs.
Do we know anything more about what happens with his family after this?
His family remains on the record, and there are, the last I see of them, there are members of the family who are involved in another glass factory that is set up in Boston after the war. So they sort of, they integrate within the American community.
And then what about Richardson? So he's in jail awaiting trial.
He is in jail awaiting trial. He is supposed to be, because of all the people upset about Christopher Seider being killed and the funeral on February 26th. Well, when a few days later, on March 5th, word goes around that the British soldier in front of the customs house has been clubbing another boy named Eddie Garrick, that produces a more angry crowd than would probably be normal. And that's what led to the Boston Massacre on the 5th of March. And the Boston Massacre overshadowed Christopher Seider's death. So suddenly there was an even bigger funeral, and suddenly there was an even bigger trial that was needed, and suddenly there was an even bigger outrage. So that's why we remember the massacre. We don't remember Christopher Seider so much. However, at the time, they were seen as the two cases very much connected through the customs office, through violence against crowds. And although the judicial authorities were able to put off the massacre trial until the late fall, they held the Ebenezer Richardson's trial in April. He had a great difficulty getting a lawyer. Finally, the court appointed Josiah Quincy Jr. and told him, you have to do this. There was a one-day trial, and Richardson was found guilty. Some people wanted to hang him immediately. Instead, the judges put off sentencing. Now, there was only one sentence possible for murder, and that was to be hanged. So as soon as the judges passed sentence, then Richardson could be taken out and killed. But instead, the judges kept putting off the sentencing because they knew, and people like Judge Peter Oliver were quite certain that this was all in self-defense. The man's house was being attacked. His family was being attacked. So they sent to London to get a special royal pardon. It took a while to get there. Took a while to come back. The paperwork wasn't right. They sent for it again. They came back. So Richardson was in jail for a couple of years. And then there was this concatenation where finally the paperwork arrived secretly. The judges knew they had the paperwork. And the Boston town meeting had a very important meeting where William Molyneux had financial interests at stake. So he was busy at the town meeting. He had all his supporters busy at the town meeting. And that was the day the judges took Richardson from jail, said, "Your pardon, get out of here."
Wow.
And he left town.
Wow.
The customs office was still trying to look after him. So they got him a job in the Philadelphia customs office. The Boston Whigs sent information about him to Philadelphia, which is probably why that one broadside showing the killing is in a Philadelphia archive. And he was sort of driven out of town there. He had to come back to Massachusetts. sort of trying to make a living any way he could. In early September 1774, during just after what's called the Powder Alarm, which is a great uprising in Cambridge and rural Massachusetts, another crowd went to his sister's house in Reading, where he was staying, and drove him out.
Wow.
And he had to go to London. The last we know of him, is he was in London in early 1775, asking the government to give him some sort of support because he had been a loyal supporter and he had suffered for their cause. And the Secretary of the Treasury or the State, I forget which branch of the government, gave him a little, and the sailor who had come in with him gave him a little bit of money, and then he disappears from the record.
Well, because you do see in the broadsides commemorating the massacre every year this lament that Ebenezer Richardson has not been hanged.
Still unhanged, yes, Ebenezer Richardson, and he was never hanged, so far as we know.
Well, good for Well, now Seider is buried along with the massacre victims in the granary. Is that
currently? Yes, they were. He was buried in a vault that belonged to the town. And then the massacre victims were placed in the same vault. And now there is one stone erected by the Sons of the American Revolution early in the 1900s that commemorates them all. Now that stone lists his name as Christopher Seider and lists him as, I believe, 12 years old, neither of which is true. Their names were, of course, very malleable back then. There were a lot of different spellings. Some people did spell it Snyder, but usually it was spelled Seider. As for his age, we don't have his birth date, but we have from Braintree, where the family was living, we have his baptism date. And that indicates that he was just about at his 11th birthday when he died.
Wow, okay. Oh, wow. Fascinating. So, you wrote in your blog this morning, you probably wrote it before this morning, about the memory of the massacre, and Josiah Quincy then in 1771, actually in February, saying we need to commemorate this or do a way of commemorating this, which is interesting. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Mentor and Josiah Quincy.
Well, this was a newspaper essay that appeared in the Boston Evening Post in February 1771, a little bit more than 11 months since the massacre. And Josiah Quincy proposed that the town set aside the anniversary day of the massacre and have two orations, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, by two different men on the political issues of the standing army and the problems of quartering troops in a populated town. These were the political issues that the Whigs had been using to argue against the troops all through 1769. And in a way, this essay is sort of arguing for a very an upper class, intellectual, legalistic argument. And as I read it, I was wondering, okay, what is he trying to head off? Is he trying to head off a more Molyneux-esque appeal to emotion? Is he trying to get himself back in good favor? If people knew, hey, this is Josiah Quincy, the man who got most of the soldiers off and who defended Richardson and defended Captain Preston, was this his way of trying to get sort of strengthen his Whig credentials? Or was this part of his sincere political beliefs now that he had done his duty as a lawyer in defending unpopular defendants? This is what he actually thought. We can't quite be sure. But in any case, starting in 1771, the town did have yearly orations about the massacre. The very first one was in March 1771 by Dr. Thomas Young. Dr. Thomas Young was probably one of the radicals that Josiah Quincy might have been worried about. And he spoke in the Manufactory Building, which was a large hall mostly used for weaving cloth, so not an official town building. We don't have his oration at all, but the town liked that idea enough that in April, so a month after the massacre, they commissioned an official oration from the school teacher, James Lovell, who is a more genteel, middle-of-the-road Whig of the sort that Josiah Quincy and the town establishment would have approved. And in 1772 until 1783, the massacre oration was always on the anniversary of the massacre or one day later if that was a Sunday.
So they really are working to keep this memory alive, but in a certain way. And as Quincy had said, what we should be talking about. And you make clear it's not a sermon, but also no one seemed to know that this was Josiah Quincy writing since it was under a pseudonym.
It's always unclear how much people knew when there were newspaper essays with pseudonyms. How much people knew that Humphrey Plowjogger was John Adams or Determinatus was Samuel Adams. Sometimes we can see in diaries and such that nobody's fooled. Other times it's still a mystery. There is a collection at the Massachusetts Historical Society of a hatter named Harbottle Doors newspapers. And whenever he knew the name of who wrote an essay, he would write the name beside it. The Mentor essay that we've been talking about, the name Josiah Quincy is written there, but to me it looks like it's a different handwriting. It's not not Harbottle Doors' usual handwriting. So I wonder if that was added later or something like that. So I'm just not sure about that one.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. So in addition to February 22nd being the anniversary of Christopher Seider's death in 1770, we also have February 22nd, which for many years was observed as George Washington's birthday. And I know you've spent years researching Washington's role in the siege of Boston. And can you tell us a bit about Washington and the 22nd of February?
Yes. Well, to start with, Washington was born on the 11th of February. But that was under the Julian calendar, so that when the Gregorian calendar was instituted in the British Empire in the early 1750s, that date, which was old style, became shifted to February 22nd. And even into the Revolutionary War and afterward, there was still some debate as to which one should we use to observe Washington's birthday, the 11th or the 22nd. The very first public observation on record of Washington's birthday was on February 11th, 1779 in Milton, Massachusetts. And the second was on February 22nd, 1779 in Williamsburg, Virginia. So even back then, they were still arguing about what should be the official birthday. Finally, Washington...
We don't have any real idea what Washington himself used for...
Eventually, Tobias Lear, who was Washington's secretary, was writing people in the 1790s saying that really he would prefer to have February 22nd be observed. So that's why we have settled on February 22nd. On the other hand, birthdays didn't mean as much then. Once you reached the age of 21, there was no longer a legal aspect to it. And so we don't see in Washington's diaries or letters that he ever was celebrating his birthday. We don't see him sitting down with a cake and having a ball or anything like that.
Wondering what Martha got him and all that.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, what did the grandchildren do? It just doesn't appear. And so there are cases like in John Adams' diary where he thinks about, I'm about to turn 42, and he feels sorry for himself as usual. And he'll do this on both dates. Because he also was born before the calendar shift. But with Washington, we just don't have that. So, for instance, he spent his, I think, 44th birthday in 1776 in Cambridge as commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army, and we don't know what he did. He didn't do anything special that day.
He's orchestrating the evacuation, right?
He might have been too busy because, yes, he was about to try to push the British out of Boston using the cannon on Dorchester Heights. Washington had been sent to Cambridge back. He arrived in July 1775 with the mission to get the British Army out of Boston. And he spent the next, 8-9 months trying everything to do that. And he would keep coming up with these plans, take them to his council of war, the other generals, and they would all say, no, that's not going to work. And plan after plan voted down unanimously. So he was extremely frustrated during his time. And yet those months were when he learned how to administer the Continental Army. He learned how to deal with civilian governments. He learned how to organize his headquarters staff. It was a very crucial time, and it was actually quite fortunate, I think, that he did not have huge battles and maneuvers and things like that to occupy him, because he had plenty of those coming up in the next year.
Yes. He really learned how to both maintain this army, but also the kind of war he was going to have to fight here. I'm wondering, why Milton in 1779? Do you know why they decided to celebrate his birthday?
That is a good question, and no, I don't know. It was a group of patriots deciding to have just a public dinner and putting it in the newspaper, and so it's quite possible that other people did this and had done this before, and just didn't get the press, didn't send the report to the newspaper. This is just the earliest documented approach. But it does show that there was this cult of personality developing around General Washington by that point.
And that's his real gift to leadership, isn't it? Is the people he was able to gather around him to help carry out a vision that perhaps even he didn't see. You think about people like Knox and Greene, who were early adherents to Washington's staff. And, can you imagine what the Siege of Boston might have been like if he had Lafayette and Hamilton and all of the other sort of young bloods that later attached themselves to his headquarters? It would have been interesting to see if it was better or worse.
Yes. Would they have encouraged his recklessness, or would he have? Because at that point he was still pressing forward, but all the generals except for Lee and Gates were the New England generals appointed by the colonies, and therefore sort of it may be too hard to say, a harsher word to say, foisted on Washington, but they were what he got. He did not have a choice in them. And some of them were a generation older than he was. Others, the previous commander-in-chief, Artemus Ward, was only a couple of years older than he was, but everyone seems to have felt he acted like a very much older man.
Yeah.
And yet, it is surprising that by 1779, with maybe a couple of battlefield victories and a couple of ties on his side and a lot of losses, Washington was popular enough in Massachusetts and in Virginia to inspire these birthday celebrations. The only public birthday celebrations that have been celebrated before were the king and queen. And so this was a way of, in some ways, this was the possibility of a monarchy or quasi-monarchy developing around Washington, something that he took steps to nip in the bud.
Yes. So, we've been talking with John Bell, who is the proprietor of the Boston 1775 blog, also the author of The Road to Conquer, the 4 Stolen Cannons that precipitated the revolution. It's been great talking to you, John, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bob.
And thank you, Jonathan Lane, our producer. And thanks to Dave Emmerich and Peter Emmerich and Doug Quigley, our musicians, who will pipe us out with The Road to Boston. So thank you, and I'll look forward to reading the blog tomorrow.
Thank you.